next up, we are going to move back over to the West Coast. We are about to hear from our colleagues at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. So, Joanna, I'll let you properly introduce the laboratory that you are also a staff member at.
Well, thanks so much, Faith. And if you're just joining us, again, happy Earth Day in our sunrise to sunset with the National Labs. We're so happy to have you joining us. And shortly, we're going to join scientists from Lawrence Livermore National Lab as they give a presentation with highlights on topics including the role of microalgae in global carbon cycling, fusion energy, and climate modeling. But first, let's learn a little bit more about Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory.
Can we produce unlimited clean energy to fuel the planet? Can we create artificial prosthetics to improve lives all over the world? And how do we make the world a safer place for humanity? These are just a few of the questions that LLNL is trying to develop solutions to every day. LLNL is one of our nation's 17 national labs, and ours is located just 60 miles from San Francisco. For decades, Lawrence Livermore National Lab has led the development and application of the innovative science and technology that our nation needs. We apply this innovation to challenges of national security, international stability, human progress, and so much more. Livermore was founded as the New Ideas Lab and still lives up to this reputation today with our intellectual leadership, originality, and audacity. Programs like the National Ignition Facility, Global Security, and supercomputing initiatives demand that we draw on the widest possible diversity of talents, thoughts, and backgrounds, people just like you. Our incredibly wide array of disciplines, from computer science to engineering to physical and life sciences, all come together here at the lab to help our nation lead the future. With cutting-edge technology in additive manufacturing, the world's most powerful and energetic laser, and one of the world's most powerful supercomputers, our teams apply frontier science and engineering to deliver solutions to the nation's problems. And along the way, we serve the public interest and sustain public trust through transparency, honesty, and objectivity. We have a driving passion to excel, lead, and ultimately to change the world. And as an institution, the lab is a place where people find great fulfillment in their work. Work-life balance is ingrained into our culture, and we provide flexible work schedules and recreational opportunities on site through our many activity groups, on-site fitness options, and wellness resources. And that's because we believe that aha moments don't always happen at your desk. The lab will continue looking to researchers with big ideas from a variety of disciplines to help unlock and solve some of the most interesting challenges facing both the nation and the world. Just think, what problems could you solve at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory? Come and build the future with us.
So, once again, welcome back to Earth Day. I'm Dr. Joanna Albala. I'm the Science Education Program Manager at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And today I'm joined with a panel of scientists that will share part of this year's Science on Saturday series on energy and the environment. We're excited to share the many ways that Lawrence Livermore National Lab is doing cutting-edge research in many different areas relevant to our planet. So joining us today is Samantha Rulis, who's a material scientist with a master's in polymer chemistry from the University of Oregon. Ty Samo, who's a marine biologist and staff scientist in the Environmental Isotope Systems Group with a PhD degree in marine biology from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego. Also joining us is Dave Schlossberg, a physicist working in the National Ignition Facility who received a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Paul Durack, an Australian oceanographer and climate scientist who received a PhD in physical oceanography. And with that, let's get started. Take it away, Samantha.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. So hi, everyone. I'm Samantha, and today I will be talking to you about trash in the air and how we can clean it up. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we all produce trash every single day. However, most of us don't realize that we also produce trash and it actually ends up in the air. And that's actually called carbon dioxide. And it happens when we burn fossil fuels. And so most of us don't realize it's there and we kind of forget about it because you can't see it and you can't smell it either. However, we produce quite a bit of it. So we each produce about 5 pounds of solid waste every single day. And we are producing about 10 pounds of carbon dioxide waste every single day. And so, the same way that you would take your trash out to the curb on trash day, we really need to find a way how to better manage the carbon dioxide that we're emitting into our air. So, today I will be talking to you about why we need to stop emitting carbon dioxide in the air, how it's getting there, and how we can get rid of it from our environment. Next slide. So, why do we need to clean the carbon dioxide in the air? Well, the Earth is out of balance. So, as we burn fossil fuels, we're emitting carbon dioxide. And this carbon dioxide is creating a misbalance in our climate. And that is called climate change. And climate change can be seen in a variety of ways, such as um, wildfires, droughts, and severe hurricanes, and in addition to the overall increasing temperatures of our environment. So before we started burning fossil fuels, the Earth itself would emit CO2 from animals and wildfires naturally. However, it was able to retain its balance because it would also create reservoirs in oceans and forests for this carbon dioxide. However, now, due to our growing society, we are burning fossil fuels to power our homes, to transport goods and people, and even to provide energy for our everyday lives. And the problem with this is that as we burn more fossil fuels, there's a blanket of carbon dioxide that's forming up over our planet. And this blanket has actually doubled in size since we started burning fossil fuels. And again, we can't see it and we can't smell it, so we usually forget it's there. However, this blanket that's covering our planet is creating a very warm environment. So we need to stop emitting carbon dioxide. Well, even after we stop emitting carbon dioxide, and we can do that by using renewable electricity and biofuels, we still are going to have that layer of carbon dioxide around us in the environment. And so if we don't remove it ourselves, we're going to still have this warming effect surrounding us, creating this climate change problem. And so here at Lawrence Livermore, we can remove carbon dioxide from the air through various ways. The first is natural solutions. The second is biomass solutions. And the third is direct air capture. And I will be talking to you today about direct air capture machines and how they filter carbon dioxide from the air. So if you can imagine a huge blanket covering the planet, you could say that if we need to remove the trash that's out there, you could just create a large filter and remove everything. And you wouldn't be wrong. That technology is actually available today and being used. So with the help of chemical filters and solvents and minerals, we can absorb some of that CO2 from our environment. So this is actually an image of a carbon capture facility in Switzerland that's operational today. So how does this technology actually work? Well, there are packings that act as filters, and carbon runs through this packing. And at the same time, a carbon capture solution, depicted here in yellow, is going to run through this packing. And this carbon capture solution is really good at holding onto carbon. So when it comes into contact with carbon, it holds onto it and becomes a carbonate solution that is collected in a reservoir. And at Lawrence Livermore, we've realized that the packings are really essential to maximizing the amount of carbon dioxide that we're able to capture. So carbon capture requires a gas and a liquid to come into contact with each other. And that is actually how your lungs work. So your lungs transfer oxygen to your blood. And so we've actually looked at lungs as an inspiration for our technology because lungs maximize the amount of gas and liquid that contact each other, which is exactly what we need to do if we want to optimize the amount of carbon that we're capturing. 3D printing here at Lawrence Livermore has really allowed us to make a wide variety of structures that we weren't able to make before. So now that with these new capabilities, we're able to make structures that really maximize the amount of gas and liquid that come together. So our task here is to design different structures that we can print and measure how efficiently they're actually trapping carbon dioxide. In addition to these 3D printing technologies, computer simulations have really helped us understand how effectively our structures are actually capturing carbon dioxide. So this is an image of Sierra, a supercomputer here at Lawrence Livermore, and it can calculate very difficult problems very quickly. And actually, if we provide a model for it, it can tell us what kind of structures we should be printing in order to reach our goals more efficiently. On the left-hand side here, you have a conventional packing that's used in industry today to capture carbon dioxide. So the simulation here shows that in a traditional packing, the carbon capture liquid that's depicted here by the dark red is going to flow through a packing structure through the center. And when we tested this out in lab, our experiments actually showed very similar results, agreeing with what the simulation had predicted. And on the right-hand side, a new optimized structure was designed, and our simulations suggested that the carbon capture liquid would be more dispersed throughout the entire packing rather than just the center like the conventional structure. And when we actually performed that experiment in lab, our results seem to support that as well. And the really cool thing about these simulations is that we can pinpoint areas that we're doing really well in and areas that we need to improve on. So this helps us be more efficient at reaching our goals without wasting time and resources. And as cool as those pictures are, we want to know if these 3D printed structures actually absorb carbon dioxide faster than conventional structures. And so we tested that. In here, this image on the left has a conventional packing structure. And on the right, you have a new optimized structure. And here, carbon dioxide is flowing from the bottom of this test reactor all the way to the top. The blue liquid that you see is carbon capture liquid. And the reason it's blue is because there's a dye in there. And as this blue liquid, the carbon capture liquid, is holding on to more and more carbon, the pH is actually going to change in the solution. And that pH change is going to trigger the color to change to yellow. So at the about 3-minute mark, we see that the conventional packing structure is still fairly blue. The new structure has a slight new tint of lighter blue. And by the almost 4-minute mark, the new structure is completely yellow, while the conventional structure still has a decent amount of blue in it. So this is telling us that our new optimized structure actually captures carbon a lot more efficiently than the traditional packing structures that are being used in industry today. And so as nice as it is to be able to do this on a lab scale, we really have a major task at hand to take that lab scale technology and convert it to a much larger scale in order to make a real impact in our environment. So we have the technology available to start removing that carbon dioxide blanket from our environment. We have the electric vehicles and these carbon capture machines. However, it's really going to take all of us to clean all the trash in the air. There is a lot of trash because we've put it there, and it's going to require not just scientists and computer scientists and engineers. It's going to require, builders and teachers and designers and planners and even the next generations in order to really help us regain the balance that we once had. Thank you.
I'll be talking to you next about the work that Lawrence Livermore National Lab is doing to understand algae and their impact on carbon cycling and sustainable biofuel and biomaterials production. But first, I just want to have everyone take a step back and just appreciate the many wonders of algae. Here are some words that might come to your mind when you think of algae. So algae can be multicellular, as we can see in these kelp beds here in the ocean. They can be bioluminescent. They can also be harmful, and there's research going on at Lawrence Livermore figuring out how to tamp down on harmful algal blooms that are harmful not only to fish and fisheries, but are also harmful to humans when they make their way into the water supply. But one thing that many people may not know is that most algae are unicellular. They're single cells, and they just float around in lakes and rivers and the ocean, just doing their thing. So you may be wondering, why do we care about algae? Well, it turns out that they're the key organisms in the global carbon cycle. And what you're seeing in this animation is the breathing of the earth. On land, you can see parts of Africa and Europe there on the right, and then the United States and South America on the left. On land, during the spring and summer, the grasses grow and become greener, and then they die back. And the same thing is happening in the ocean. So algae are blooming, and in both cases, when algae and plants are doing this, they're taking in CO2, and then they're producing oxygen, which it has enabled the Earth to be habitable. So you can thank algae and plants for that. Some of you may be wondering, how are they so amazing? Well, the answer is photosynthesis, as you probably already know. And what photosynthesis is algal and plant chloroplasts' ability to incorporate energy, water, carbon dioxide in a chemical reaction that generates oxygen and sugar, or glucose. And this is the official chemical equation for that, the correct stoichiometry and all of that. And so because they're able to do this, they're able to generate oxygen, draw down CO2, and make biomass and sugars and things like that for themselves. And algae are very small, but they actually produce 50% of the oxygen on Earth. And that's because they can grow so quickly and so numerously in the oceans. And that's in contrast to plants, which are almost always there, more or less, but they grow a little bit slowly. So they have these two different strategies. And so plants are responsible for the other 50%. So every second breath you take is due to algae or plants doing photosynthesis and letting you breathe this oxygen, but also drawing down CO2, which is very important. And as Sam brought up earlier, we have a big carbon problem on planet Earth, and it's mostly due to humanity. It turns out that humanity produces more CO2 than algae and plants can absorb. So every year, human activities release around 10 petagrams of carbon, and 1 petagram is the mass of 200 million African elephants, which, even when it's put that way, it's mind-boggling. It's even hard to even put that into your brain and figure out what that means. Plants and algae combined absorb 4 petagrams of carbon per year. So there's a net 6 petagrams of CO2 produced every year. So that CO2 blanket that Sam was mentioning is getting thicker and thicker every year. And we can see this in the atmosphere if we look since 2000, but we have records way before this. And it shows that over time, the CO2 concentration is increasing because every year we outpace the planet's ability to reabsorb CO2. And when we look at temperatures in the ocean, we see that they've also been rising during that time because CO2, when you have a warmer atmosphere, water warms as well. And I think it's fairly safe to say that climate change is the major crisis of our times, since it has these wide-ranging impacts, as well as completely unknown impacts. So there are unknown unknowns happening here. So it's important to try to address this and figure out strategies to mitigate climate change. At Lawrence Livermore, the work that we're doing is attempting to improve the drawdown abilities of algae and make them grow better so that there can be more widely available renewable fuels and materials. So as it stands right now, when you grow algae that you've collected from the ocean, there's lots of different strains that you can use. They don't grow robustly, or there's situations where they crash out. And so when you try to refine their biomass into fuels, prices are very expensive. And that's from a consumer standpoint. Gas prices are bad right now, but no one's going to want to pay, $10, $15 a gallon. And so that's an issue, right? So our work at Lawrence Livermore is attempting to make the algae grow more robustly, faster, such that prices are significantly decreased. And this is important because if we can form our own pool of carbon within these pools of algae that are growing, then we can refine that fuel. And when it's burned in cars for transportation purposes, or for transport on ships, or for commercial airlines, that CO2 enters the atmosphere. But the important thing is that it is then reabsorbed by the algae. So you can see that it's circular. It's not a one-way movement of carbon from deep in the earth into the atmosphere where it stays. It gets reabsorbed by the algae. Those algae grow, the fuel is recycled, and the process is circular or renewable. And we call this carbon neutral. And at Lawrence Livermore, we're growing these algae in these mini raceways. So these are just miniature versions of what commercial plants do in order to study how they grow. And we have a paddle wheel that keeps the pond mixed. We have little sensors to tell us how much CO2 the algae are incorporating, and then that makes its way into a sensor array for us to go back and look at the data for temperature and CO2 and things like that. But algae are incredibly small, and so small challenges make for extremely big challenges. Just to give you another sense of scale, I'm showing a human hair here, which is approximately 100 microns in diameter, and an algal cell, which is on average 20 to 30 microns or so in diameter. So you can see that 3 algal cells are the width of a human hair. So minuscule, extremely, extremely small. And you might be wondering, how do we look at things that are this tiny? Well, we use microscopy. And so I'm showing here a slide that I'm then putting on this microscope on the stage. I'm adjusting the stage in order to align the microscope objectives so that we can magnify the image. And then I'm checking that there's light to generate some contrast, taking a peek to make sure that the algae are in focus, making some adjustments, and then actually sending the image to the computer where we can see things a little bit more clearly and get a better sense of what's going on. So these red dots are the chlorophyll autofluorescence of the algae, and that's just a transmitted light view just to see what the algae look like. And then I'm zooming in subsequent portions of this video. So you can see the little scale bar down there. That line is 50 microns. And now we've zoomed in. We're zoomed in pretty far, and we can see the algae here, and we can see all this kind of stuff surrounding them. And that's important later on. I'll get to that. And so microscopy is an important tool for us at the lab to figure out how these algae are growing and how they're interacting with their environment. It really lets us look at ecology that's playing out at the microscale. And so here's an example of a ciliate consuming this algal cell. And when I mentioned previously that sometimes biofuels don't grow as well as they should, this is one reason why. These ciliates somehow make their way in to these algal ponds, and then they just nom up all those algae, which is not good, right? You want the algae to be there. You want to turn their biomass into fuels and products. So if we can figure out how to keep these ciliates from consuming the algae, then that's a win, and the algae grow better. One other thing that we're interested in is looking at how algae form beneficial or mutualistic symbioses with their environment. And one way we think about that is using examples from the real world. So in this example, there's a remora that's interacting with a shark. Remoras are mutualistic with sharks because they clean the outside of the shark and they clean the shark's teeth, and the shark is healthier and has more vitality as a result of that. So microscopy helps us figure this out because we can then look at their microbiome or their bacterial community and how that bacterial community is helping the algae grow. So in the red here, we have the chlorophyll that's showing up from these nanochloropsis algal cells, and then all the blue dots are the bacteria that comprise that microbiome. And you can see they're forming this attachment interaction, and we know that if they're attaching, they're interacting very strongly and helping each other in some way. And so we have tools in addition to microscopy to help us figure out how that's playing out. I wanted to quickly share some real world data on how we're doing this. So we grow in the lab, we grow our algae under optimal lab conditions because we want to make sure that they're growing and happy. And so we can see when we grow the algae with a microbiome, they grow better, they grow faster, their cells are bigger, which is a good thing. You want big cells because you know that there's lots of material in there that can be converted and refined. And so each of the dots on this graph are a single cell that we observed. So on the left, we have algae alone, and then on the right, we have algae with their microbiome. And we see that the microbiome is helpful because the algae are bigger. When we mimic outdoor summer conditions, specifically in Arizona, so high light and high temperature, we see that actually the microbiome is not helpful and the algal cells are smaller. And so what could be happening is that the light and heat stress is actually causing the microbiome to change such that there's no more bacteria that are helping the algae, or there are more bacteria that like to eat the algae. So not all bacteria are beneficial. So there might be some here that are causing the algae to grow slow or eating them. And so this is an important observation because it makes us go back to the lab and figure out how we can tweak the microbiome and make it cope with this light and heat stress. So you can see that in our investigations of algae, we predominantly use observations and quantitative data to study algae to make them grow. But it's just one of many tools that we use. And we need a lot of expertise in the science in the future. We need expertise in things like genomics and genetic engineering, chromatography, mass spectrometry, material science, and data analysis. And I'm calling out mass spectrometry here because this is a tool that we use in the lab called a nanosims, which actually lets us see how chemicals and compounds are exchanged between algae and their microbiome, or algae and their predators like those ciliates that I showed. So yes, thanks very much. I think we'll be moving into the next talk.
Thanks so much, Ty. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Dave Sloshberg. I am a scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and I am thrilled today to talk to you about something I'm passionate about, which is bringing star power to Earth and harnessing nuclear fusion. So if we can go to the next slide. What you're looking at here is the building at Lawrence Livermore National Lab that houses the world's largest and most energetic laser, the National Ignition Facility. In fact, it's 192 separate laser beams that are generated, amplified, focused, and aligned onto a small spherical capsule containing fusion fuel. What does any of this have to do with Earth Day, you may ask? Well, at the NIF, we create a small star on Earth for a brief amount of time, which could demonstrate the feasibility of using what's called nuclear fusion as an alternative energy source. So for context, we've just heard from Sam about mitigating trash in the air and Ty about impact of microalgae. This talk is about developing an alternative energy source that's clean and energy dense that could be a game changer. How does this actually work, you may ask? Well, let's dive into the details. Next slide. Our research is typically conducted through experiments and simulations. Next. And because of time, I won't go into the machine learning and the simulations in detail today, but I encourage you to check out this link, which gives you more details on the simulation and machine learning aspect of things. So let's talk about the motivation for why we're doing this. If you go to the next slide, energy may become the most scarce and valuable resource during our lifetime. What you're looking at is a graph of total energy usage on the vertical axis in kilowatt hours times 10 to the 12. So in your house, you may have a 1,000-watt light bulb, which is pretty bright. This vertical axis is 1 trillion of those 1,000-watt light bulbs. So it's a huge amount of energy usage. And the horizontal axis is time. And you can see that by 2050, global energy use will increase by nearly 50%. If you go to the next slide, we can see that the sources of that energy are comprised of different types of power. There's petroleum, there's coal, there's natural gas. We've heard about renewable energy earlier in the day for Earth Day. And at the top, there's nuclear power. Now, I want to make one distinction that right now, the nuclear power we have is nuclear fission. So that takes an atom and splits it apart. The nuclear power that we're researching at the National Ignition Facility is nuclear fusion, which takes 2 atoms and puts them together to create power. So that's one motivation for the research we're doing. On the next slide is another motivation, namely that as population centers grow exponentially, we will need a clean, energy-dense power source. What do I mean by energy dense? Well, you can see that pretty clearly on this satellite image from NASA of the Earth at night. And population centers are just lit up. You can see on the eastern seaboard of the US, all through Europe and in Japan, and Asia, Southeast Asia. These population centers need a power supply that provides a lot of energy in a relatively small form factor. If you go to the next, we can see that nuclear fusion, and what I hope to convince you is that nuclear fusion can provide this clean, energy-dense power source. Okay, so what is nuclear fusion? Where can we find examples of this? Nuclear fusion is the process that powers stars and creates heavy elements. So if I told you that when you before you logged in this morning or this afternoon, you actually saw a working fusion reactor, would that be true? Actually, it is true. If you go to the next slide, you can see that our sun is a working fusion reactor. The process that powers the sun, our nearest stellar neighbor, is nuclear fusion. And it's on a huge scale. It's 1.4 times 10 to the 9 meters, which is 1.4 billion meters in diameter. If you go to the next slide, you can see that our sun is a 5 billion-year-old nuclear fusion reactor. Nearly all of the energy that's radiated from the Earth, to the Earth, was produced via nuclear fusion. Furthermore, heavy elements are produced via nuclear fusion or indirectly through supernova. And for decades, we have worked to harness this power on Earth. Okay, well, let's get into the details of what actually is nuclear fusion. During nuclear fusion, 2 or more nuclei combine to form different nuclei and particles. And we can see that graphically on the next slide, where we're going to look at 2 isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium. And those are the isotopes that we use at the National Ignition Facility to investigate nuclear fusion. When we get those isotopes very hot, they will come together, collide, overcome their Coulomb barrier, and produce helium and a neutron as products. An additional output is energy. You can see that here on this slide on the right. So in addition to 2 new nuclei, we also get out energy. Well, where does this energy come from? If you go to the next slide, what I'll share with you is that if you were paying very, very close attention, you can rewind on YouTube, the masses of the reactants that went into the fusion process are actually heavier than the products. So there's more mass at the beginning than at the end. Where does that mass go? If you go to the next slide, we can see that fusion converts mass to energy. And I'll ask the general audience now, can you name an equation that relates the 2 quantities of mass and energy? E equals m, and then there's something on the right side. And if you go to the next 2 slides, I think, or one more, the missing term is c squared, which is the speed of light. So it's a very large number. So a very small amount of mass converts to a very large amount of energy because you take that small mass deficit and multiply it by c squared, by c, and by c again, and you get a large amount of energy out. And in fact, on our sun, it produces roughly 9 times 10 to the 37 fusion reactions per second. So when you take the amount of energy in each of those reactions and you calculate it out, that's actually 2 times 10 to the 26 watts, which ends up being a trillion 100-watt light bulbs, which is an amazing amount of power. And so if we can harness that power, even on a small scale on Earth, we can have an alternative, clean, energy dense power source. So how do we do that? If you go to the next slide, we can see that there's 3 ways to control a fusion plasma or a nuclear fusion process. We've talked about gravitational confinement, which is the sun. Another method is magnetic confinement, which is currently under investigation all across the world. And then what we're going to focus on today is on the right-hand side, and it's called inertial confinement. And that's the kind of nuclear fusion confinement that we study on the National Ignition Facility. If you go to the next slide, there's 3 ingredients for inertial confinement fusion, and I'm going to show them here. The first is lasers, and you can see here the building that we looked at the beginning of the talk, kind of with the top off, and it's about 160 meters long, so it's a very large facility needed to safely amplify the lasers. And then the next 2 ingredients are actually on a much smaller scale. If you go to the next 2 ingredients are what's called a hohlraum, which is essentially a gold cylinder that you can think of like an X-ray oven. And then inside that gold cylinder is this capsule of those 2 isotopes that we talked about. Remember, deuterium and tritium were the isotopes of hydrogen that make nuclear fusion happen. Inside that small capsule, which is really only 2 millimeters in diameter, are those isotopes, and that capsule is what gets compressed to very high densities and temperatures and essentially creates a star on Earth for about 100 trillionths of a second. So the length scales here are somewhat mind-boggling. You know, we have 160 meters, which is 400 feet, all the way down to about 2 millimeters. If you go to the next slide, we can see all 3 ingredients essentially on one slide here. And what you're looking at are the lasers of the NIF coming in from the top. They hit the walls of the gold cylinder and create X-rays. Those X-rays then heat up the capsule in the middle, that glowing white ball, and that actually gets compressed down at about 1,000,000 miles per hour to very high densities and temperatures. When that happens, the fusion process occurs, and we get out that energy from that mass deficit. Let's, in the interest of time, let's skip this slide. And what I want to do is just give you again a sense of kind of the scale of things, because you can't, at the moment, actually visit the NIF facility, but I encourage you to take a trip there if you can. What you're looking at is the top-down view of the building that houses the lasers. If you go to the next slide, we can see some key points along the laser beam line. If you go to the next, you can see the path traced out of the lasers, where the lasers begin. They get amplified through the laser amplifiers. They travel through the laser beam line, which is roughly a mile long, and then they all converge in what's called the target chamber. And that's a 30-foot diameter chamber in which we conduct these experiments where we make nuclear fusion happen. If you go to the next slide, this is an image of what that chamber looks like from the outside. What you can see from the top are the laser beam lines coming in. That blue ball near the bottom center of the screen is that 30-foot diameter chamber, to give you a sense of scale. And then because we're in a virtual environment, we can actually go inside the target chamber. And that's on this slide, where you can see now the inside of that vacuum vessel. And on the right-hand side is a positioner that holds the target, which is that gold cylinder and that very small capsule. And you can see in the center of the screen a circle. And then in the center of that circle, you can maybe just barely make out the fusion experiment. And when the lasers are incident and fusion happens, it looks something like this. So I just want to leave you with this last slide, which is the next one, of some recent progress that we've made in the evolution of developing nuclear fusion for power. One important criteria is, of course, to get out more power than you put in, right? That makes sense. If you want to have a power plant, you need more power out than you put in. And just recently, we've reached the point where we're getting about 70% of the input energy back out. So we're quite close. Now, I must say that this experiment is on a very scientific level. It's not at an industrial commercialized level just yet, but this is an encouraging step forwards. There's a vast amount of work that we need to do, but it's an encouraging step forwards. So if you go 2 slides ahead, I'll just leave you with this image and this message that Lawrence Livermore's National Ignition Facility is harnessing nuclear fusion for use on Earth. And there's a couple links. I encourage you to check them out. Thanks so much. Happy Earth Day.